All right, it's 2 minutes after and we have a pile of information to get through, so let's get started. Welcome to the 2024 Land Use and Housing Legislation Overview. I'm Casey McPherson, the Senior Planner in DOLA's Division of Local Government Community Development Office. Today, we're going to cover 5 bills that my office is focused on for implementation. And they're listed here in the order of the presentation: residential occupancy limits, minimum parking, accessory dwelling units, transit-oriented communities, and affordable housing planning. I've also listed a few other notable bills that this audience may be interested in, but please note that since we're not implementing them here in my office, I may be short on details should you have questions, but could connect you with the right people. By way of some preliminary notes, I do have listed here a map of our Metropolitan Planning Organization areas, because applicability in the bills we'll discuss today is often limited to those areas. So keep this map in mind. Also, notable here at the top, any required reporting. Oh, am I not sharing my screen? Thank you for pinging me. Apologies, everyone. Backing right up. But when I clicked it, had not. Now are you seeing my screen? Yes, okay. Bit of a false start. So starting again from the top, 2024 Land Use and Housing Legislative Overview. Again, for those of you who may have just joined, I'm Casey McPherson, the Senior Planner in DOLA's Division of Local Government Community Development Office. So now that you can see this slide, here are the 5 bills that we're going to be going over today: occupancy limits, parking, accessory dwelling units, transit-oriented communities, and affordable housing planning, as well as the list of other bills that you may find of interest. And if you have more questions, let me know and I can connect you with people who know more. All right, now you should be seeing also the map. Here are the MPO areas in Colorado, so keep this in mind as we talk through applicability throughout the presentation. And then this list of other notes here on the left. Any required reporting that you'll see throughout the bills slash laws. Also, yes, I should have noted this even in the bullets. Please forgive me if I say bill versus law. These bills have become law, but I am experiencing old habits dying hard. First off, any required reporting necessitates developing form and manner documents. So what are those going to look like? And we're going to be working on that internally, but we're also going to need some stakeholder engagement so that we can work through how to make sure those reporting forms are both effective and more efficient. Any grant program also necessitates program policies and procedures development. So again, internal work contemplated with stakeholder engagement. Hopefully you're noticing a theme now. Several bills have components of them that do mandate specific consultations, and outside of mandatory consultation, stakeholder engagement will be critical for shaping implementation of all of this work that we will discuss. And then finally, there's a lot already happening behind the scenes. So please note, we've been working on web development. Our initial pages are now live, and Robin will drop the link to that in the chat. It's also listed later in the slides, the web address. And yes, a recording of this will be made available and distributed to the attendee list. As we move through the discussion today, please do submit any questions that you have into the chat. We'll be posting a recording of this webinar as well as FAQs informed by the questions that come up today, as well as others that we've already received. All right, moving into the main event. We're going to start off with House Bill 24-1007, prohibit residential occupancy limits. The components of this bill are simple. Local governments must not limit residential occupancy based on familial relationship. And this law does take effect very soon, July 1st, 2024. Here's the flexibility within that bill. Local governments may still limit residential occupancy based on demonstrated health and safety standards. So that's the IBC, fire code, CDPH&E standards, or affordable housing program guidelines. We do have this basic overview information now, as of yesterday, live on our website. And then we will be adding some compliance guidance very shortly. Very shortly, I'll just say that. So if you're wondering what are the different ways that we could approach this to be compliant, you can look there soon and also get a hold of us at any time. All right, short and sweet. Now this one's a little bit longer. House Bill 24-1304, minimum parking requirements. The components of this bill, first off with applicability, it'll apply to areas in MPOs and at least partially within applicable transit service areas as defined in the bill now law. Local governments must not enact or enforce local laws requiring minimum parking for multifamily residential, for adaptive reuse for residential, or adaptive reuse for mixed use that includes 50% or more of use for residential. What is a transit service area? Well, that is defined in the bill text. And also DOLA will be publishing a transit service area map. That too, please file that one away as a chance for engagement. We are currently doing data acquisition and not quite ready to touch base, but that will necessitate some discussion review to make sure that the information is accurate in those maps. But if you're wondering, for now, the law does clearly state, what kinds of routes and the area from those routes that this would apply to. There's also a list of required support, which includes DOLA publishing best practices and technical assistance materials. And then there is some required reporting, but it's very particular. It's an annual report only for those jurisdictions that move forward with one particular piece of flexibility. So let's talk further about that. There is a lengthy list of retained authority in the bill. So despite what's in there, nothing prevents a local government from providing ADA protections, so parking spaces for ADA, parking maximums, being awarded funds that do require a ratio of parking. This bill will not get in the way of that. Enforcing agreements made from approvals prior to the effective date, again, July 1st. Minimum bicycle parking requirements, requiring of voluntarily provided spaces, owners charging a fee for use, owners contributing to a parking enterprise system or sharing plan, or applying EV charging requirements. And then finally, here's that little bit that would necessitate a report. Minimum parking can be required for developments of 20 units or more, or containing regulated affordable housing. But please note, the requirement cannot exceed one space per unit, and the jurisdiction must publish findings of substantial negative impacts of not having the minimums. Key dates in this bill, DOLA publishing the map, that's the end of September, so it's coming up soon, and we're working away to get that into a reviewable state. At the end of this year is the deadline for publishing best practices and technical assistance materials. Middle of next year is the deadline to no longer enact or enforce parking minimums locally. And then at the end of 2026 is that report, again, only if applicable. So only for jurisdictions that decided to move forward with some parking minimum requirements as allowed in the language. And then finally, resources. I put the full language here because best practices and technical assistance materials can mean all kinds of things. And what this bill is contemplating is focusing on parking supply and managing parking in ways that increase the production of affordable housing and housing supply. And then, of course, there is some preliminary information on our website, and we'll be adding more as able. Accessory dwelling units, House Bill 24-1152. And as you'll note, my plan is to move forward through the overview, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. But again, please do add any questions at any time into the chat. If anyone who's co-hosting is able to answer, they will, or we'll handle that during the Q&A section, and or we'll post that in the FAQs when we post the recording. All right, ADUs. Components. The ADU law applies to local governments within MPOs, so it's municipalities of 1,000 or more in population, and census designated places of 40,000 or more in population. Those jurisdictions must allow one ADU wherever single family detached units are allowed. They also must approve any ADU application with an administrative process. So it's staff taking it on, not elevating to a public hearing. And then cannot require parking or owner occupancy. There are limited exceptions to that we'll go over next. So there are exceptions, but generally not requiring parking or owner occupancy or applying restrictive design or development standards. This also does apply to PUDs and HOAs. There's a certification process. So there will be reporting to show compliance with allowing ADUs where single family is allowed, and also implementation of one or more strategies encouraging the construction or conversion from a menu that we will make available. As a note, non-subject jurisdictions can opt in by making these modifications and adopting a strategy to encourage construction or conversion. And the benefit of doing that is access to the ADU fee reduction encouragement program. This is a grant program that we will be launching that can fund development of pre-approved plans, local technical assistance, or reducing fees. And by the way, there's also funding for financing options at CHAFA. We've been asked, what about sort of direct to homeowners and it's sort of other funding that's contemplated. So please note that there are financing options, but CHAFA is leading that piece. Flexibility in the ADU bill/law. There's a whole slew, like in some of the others, of sort of nothing prevents language. So nothing prevents a local government, a subject jurisdiction, from requiring a parking space, here's that parking exception, to be designated if there's an existing driveway, garage, tandem parking, or off-street space, or if not, but parking is required as of the 1st of this year, and on-street parking is prohibited on that block. So if there's if you're feeling stuck in a tight spot, know that there's that little carve out. Also regarding owner occupancy, it can be required at the time of application to construct or convert an ADU, except for new construction, meaning if it's done concurrently with the primary, or for a short-term rental license. Subject jurisdictions can also allow smaller or larger ADUs. The requirement is between 500 and 750 square feet. So subject jurisdictions can go smaller or larger, not larger than the principal. They can also allow multiple ADUs. They can continue to run impact fees, however that's been going, as well as short-term rental regulations. Historic district standards and procedures can be applied. That one I want to underline, that's come up a few times. So yes, that can be continued. And then also life safety code can be applied. So utilities, fire, stormwater, those all can be considered. And there may be cases where permit applications need to be denied for those reasons. Subject jurisdictions can define ADUs to include motorhomes and rec vehicles or not. And they can require water and wastewater capacity letters. A few key dates, just a couple. The middle of next year is the compliance report being due to DOLA. This is a one-time report, and we'll have an approval, an extension process. If I could exert any influence, it would be to recommend connecting with us early and often, much more in the next bill, in the TOC bill. But even in this one, if there's any concern about, are we compliant? How's this looking? Please do reach out at your earliest convenience. My hope is that we can move into the report submittal process confident that everything's all squared away. And then there are a number of resources contemplated in the ADU bill, a toolkit that's subject to appropriation. So that means I can't quite lay out or guarantee what that might look like, but the idea is to provide technical assistance, resources, and tools. There's also a factory built structure model code in there that the Division of Housing is leading. And then we have, of course, the fee reduction and encouragement grant program. Okay. That's it for ADUs. Now, moving along, the transit-oriented communities bill, and then the next one, the housing planning bill, they're a little bit longer. So if this has felt like a bit of a lightning round, we can slow down here and get into a little bit more detail. And before we dive in here on House Bill 24-1313, Housing and Transit-Oriented Communities, I'd like to say that this is it's a detailed bill, it's a nuanced bill law. Sorry, and thank you for your patience with my word changes. But the good news is 1313 is detailed because it has a great deal of flexibility. So this law is also paired with guidance for each bit of flexibility. So there should be a lot of information that we're going to be creating to support, how is this working? How do things look locally? What kind of changes are possible? Lots and lots of contemplated flexibility and support with that. Many communities already do have a vision for TOD or for mixed use and are already doing this work. So the goal of this bill is not to toss that vision aside, because there are potentially many pathways in the law to implement your existing vision or to make that the starting point for any changes. So as long as any existing vision has a logical rationale for identifying where housing production is viable and putting as much of it as possible near frequent transit, the law does offer many pathways to make your ideas work. Each community is unique in this respect. And as you'll see in the slides themselves, as well as my commentary, we hope you'll connect with us early and often to discuss your approach. Okay, kicking off with applicability. The TOC law is narrower than the ones that we have been discussing so far. So I just went ahead and listed the applicable jurisdictions here on the right. So jurisdictions that need to calculate a housing opportunity goal and designate transit centers, which we will go through, are municipalities in MPOs with a population of 4,000 or more, with 75 acres or more of transit areas, which is areas near frequent transit service. It also applies to counties, also within MPOs and near light rail or commuter rail stations, or have unincorporated areas that are completely surrounded by municipalities, so those enclaves. We're going to focus a lot on subject jurisdictions, but please note that jurisdictions that are not subject, in fact, statewide, can opt in through the neighborhood centers listed in this law. So those are, again, there's a process we need to go through to nail down the criteria with stakeholder engagement, but finding a way to delineate what a neighborhood center might be. That's a walkable, mixed use kind of center, if not actually in a transit area, which we'll talk about the transit areas much more. Okay, as promised, here are the components and what needs to be done. So if you're a subject jurisdiction, here are the steps for you. Step one is to use DOLA's map of transit areas to calculate a jurisdiction-wide housing opportunity goal or HOG. So that is a map, much like the parking bill, that we will be publishing. It's on the same timeline, by the way. And if you're wondering what that may look like in 1313 as well, it's very clear language about types of transit service and distance from a corridor or from a station. So if you'd like a sneak peek, go ahead and check out those definitions, and then know that we are continuing to be in data acquisition mode and doing some preliminary map drafting, and look forward to stakeholder engagement on those maps and all the other pieces here as well. Okay, so again, step one, use the map, calculate the HOG. Step two, identify any gap between existing zone capacity and that HOG. So what do we already allow through our zoning, through our development standards, and what's the delta there? Step three, designating any transit centers if necessary to meet the HOG. So where locally, so again, this is all the local subject jurisdiction who's taking these steps. Where do we want our density to go? Where is it already? Where could we add some? Asking some of those questions and deciding where transit centers best belong. And then step four, evaluate existing affordability and displacement mitigation strategies, any that maybe need to be added. Again, there's a menu we'll be publishing on that, and then creating an implementation plan for any selected strategies. There are some reporting requirements in this law. There's a preliminary report due the middle of next year. Again, I hope that we're connecting before that time to be supportive in the best way possible. And then there's a final report at the end of 2026. There's some additional time to complete zoning and strategy, adoption, implementation planning by the end of 2027. But after that final report process is sort of underway and done, that's when we'll be able to launch the grant program. So there's a benefit of getting it done by the final reporting timeline. And then there's also ongoing 3-year status reporting, so lesser level reporting and every 3 years. Okay, now sometimes a picture can say 1,000 words. So I have wrangled Nathan Lindquist from CDOT to come and talk to you about some examples of how to define transit areas and transit centers. Nathan, if you want to go ahead and unmute and take it away.
Yeah, hi everybody. Nathan Lindquist, Senior Land Use Planner with CDOT, and helped with the development of the bill with DOLA and other agencies. Going back to a little bit of what Casey said at the top, this is a very detailed bill. So we wanted to dive into just a couple areas where we've already heard questions from local governments about how this works. And one really important part of this is the difference between transit areas and transit centers. And those are really similar terms, so easy to confuse. But it's really critical to understand that transit areas is just kind of the areas around transit routes and transit stations that are used to calculate the HOG. Whereas then transit centers are the areas where the local governments decide to locate the dense zoning to meet the HOG. So two different pieces, and the very important part is that, and why it was structured this way, is that not all areas around these transit stations and routes have to have dense zoning, and we've kind of heard that confusion from some folks still. And so we just want to make it really clear that this was a big part of the flexibility to say you can do it really a lot more densely around one area and leave other areas not with zoning, as long as the housing opportunity goal is met. And that's a jurisdiction-wide housing opportunity goal. So you can really move the density around to where it makes sense. Next slide. Another aspect of the flexibility in the bill, and this came from discussions with a lot of the planners on the call during the session, is there's flexibility around where you locate these transit centers. And while, of course, ideally, if you can be within the transit area to get more housing closer to transit, which is the primary goal of the bill, then that's great. But we've, of course, realized that from talking to local planners, there's a lot of very valid reasons in many cases why either it's not feasible to get the housing that close to transit, or the goals of the bill can be just as easily met in other areas like walkable mixed-use centers or between a 1/4 mile and a 1/2 mile from the transit area. So both those are options with parameters that are more detailed in the bill. The next slide talks about another piece of this that gets into some nuance that is important to discuss, and maps and graphics really help. The optional transit area piece in the bill is to say, if you've kind of shown we're getting about all the density we can near the 15-minute transit or near the light rail stations, and we've kind of shown, for a variety of good logical reasons, we just can't get all the density to meet the housing opportunity goal there. And we've got these opportunities on maybe 30-minute bus routes in another part of our community. You can also then discuss with DOLA and get approval to do that. And a lot of flexibility in there. And I think the language in the bill kind of points toward just showing a good rationale for why that makes sense. And I think from talking to a lot of communities during the development of the bill, there are a lot of good rational reasons out there why that will make sense for some folks. So I think to Casey's point at the top too, the key will be, kind of bringing, if you've got a community vision, bringing that to DOLA early on, and maybe starting there and just saying, this is kind of where we thought density makes sense. How much of this can work? And don't feel like if you've done a lot of this good work already that it needs to be, kind of like starting from scratch. I think we learned through the process, a lot of folks are doing great work on this already and should be recognized and utilized going forward. So I'll turn it back over to Casey.
Great. Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, the risk of overstating, I made this its own slide. I'm such a fan. Please do contact us early and often to discuss your community's plans for how zoning can work within the requirements and flexibilities provided in 1313, the TOC law. Okay. Moving right along. So as you may be getting used to now, here's the list, the first half of the list for the retained authority in the TOC law. So nothing is going to prevent a subject jurisdiction from enforcing infrastructure standards, so denying or conditioning a permit based on infrastructure insufficiency. Impact fees as well, it's not touched. So subject jurisdictions can also approve applications with a lower net density than the max that's allowed, just as happens now. They can also allow variable zoning capacity across transit areas, including not designating some, well, that should be transit, yes, transit centers as transit. Well, okay, let me try that one again. What I wish this said was, subject jurisdictions can allow variable zoning capacity across, certainly, yes, transit areas, but transit centers as well, including not designating some transit areas as transit centers. So we got a question, early question about, hey, does every designated transit center have to have the same zoning? Does that have to be uniform? And the answer is no. If more belongs in one part of town as compared to another, that's totally fine as long as the overall housing opportunity goal is reached. Those do not need to be uniform centers. Other things, there can still be discretionary approval for a list of other actions, subdivisions, rezonings, variances. There can be greater net density or more permissive standards. There can be a discretionary review process at the applicant's option. If they say, yes, please, then that is possible. There's no requirement to publicly disclose confidential water supply or facility information. Subject jurisdictions can allow commercial, business, or mixed use within transit centers, yes. And then they can also deny or condition an application due to a traffic study. Lots of things listed there. Here are the key dates. So same as the parking bill or parking map due date, September 30th, DOLA will publish a transit area and walkshed maps. Early next year, we'll be providing housing opportunity goal calculation model and guidance. So if you're wondering, well, how do our development standards translate into allowed density? We have been directed to create a calculation model for that and accompanying guidance. Middle of next year, the preliminary assessment report is due to us for review, as well as we will be publishing affordability menus, displacement risk assessment guidance and strategies. And then at the end of 2026, there's a process that I meant to flag, but not sort of belabor today. But if you're a community who has water issues, like very strong water insufficiency issues, then there's a process for that. So if that applies to you, please read carefully what's in the language for that. And there's a notice and reporting requirement there. Also at the end of 2026 is when the final housing opportunity goal report is due, as well as, again, the status reports every 3 years. And then at the end of 2027 is when the housing opportunity goal becomes state law and DOLA is obligated to provide notice of any non-compliance. Resources. We have the infrastructure grant program. So all of government statewide that have designated transit centers and have been certified, or the opt-in neighborhood center communities, are eligible for this grant program. There's also the affordable housing tax credits at CHAFA. So that's available for affordable housing developers for projects in transit centers, neighborhood centers, and technical assistance. So we must provide TA complementing the grant program and publish that calculation model we just discussed to support local governments with designating those transit centers. End of TOC, and here is our final bill for discussion. Then I'll have some wrap up and we'll go into Q&A. But first, Senate Bill 24-174. It's called Sustainable Affordable Housing Assistance. We have been more casually calling it housing planning. So if you'll permit me, that's the language I'll use for our discussion today. All right, components of this one. The housing planning law focuses on basically, well, housing planning, starting off with housing needs assessments. These apply to all local governments that have 1,000 or more in population, unless there's been a negative population change of 1% or more in the last census, or if they participated in a regional housing need assessment process. So those are the communities that will need to do an HNA. HNAs also must conform to DOLA's methodology to be created and the requirements listed in statute, which will be incorporated into the methodology, by the way. There are also housing action plans that follow up the housing needs assessments. These housing action plans are required of local governments of 5,000 or more in population, or 1,000 or more that participated in a regional HNA, or rural resort communities as of the first of this year. That's as sort of defined in statute and sort of managed by DOH. So let me know if you are wondering if that is you or not. There's also a grant program, the Housing Needs Planning Technical Assistance Fund for the HNAs for doing this work, as well as a whole host of other technical assistance listed in there, including materials, training, tools, templates, and functioning as a clearinghouse of information. So lots of TA contemplated in this Senate Bill 174. There's also a directory where we will publish affordability strategies and displacement mitigation strategies. At this point, you might be saying, oh, I see some overlap between this bill and 1313. Yes, they do sort of speak the same language, and we are working to combine these requirements and supportive resources at the same time. There are a couple of state reports also where DOLA leads, facilitates engagement for, and publishes a statewide strategic growth report and a natural and agricultural interjurisdictional opportunities report. There are also some requirements around state grants criteria where we will update to prioritize projects in and supporting neighborhood centers, as well as compliant local governments, subject jurisdictions regarding whether they've completed the HNAs and housing action plans and some comprehensive plans requirements. Speaking of, the comprehensive plan requirements are that these plans must include, and there's some nuance in the law about exactly who it applies to based on your size, but generally a strategic growth element and a water supply element by the end of 2026. The flexibility in this one is primarily found in participating in a regional housing needs assessment. So if you're a community of 1,000 or more in population, probably the most flexibility to be found will be participating in a regional HNA, and then the obligations there are reduced to participation, doing a housing action plan, and of course the comp plan requirements. Lots of information on the timeline for this one. Takes a whole slide, but this is all pretty critical, so let's walk through. At the end of this year, DOLA will publish methodologies for state, regional, and local HNAs, and also displacement assessment guidance. Middle of next year, we'll be publishing affordability menus, displacement strategy directory, and neighborhood center criteria. So a bell should be ringing, or flag should be going up, or whatever, about similar requirements from 1313. So yes, again, we are working to consolidate the menus that we'll be publishing to give more of a one-stop shop for these menus and supportive resources. At the end of, or towards the end of next year, is when we will be publishing the statewide strategic growth report, as well as the natural land and ag land interjurisdictional opportunities report. We will also be updating grant award criteria to prioritize neighborhood centers. And at the end of 2026, local HNAs are due to DOLA for acceptance. Towards the end of 2027, we will be publishing a statewide HNA, reports on all HNAs done to date, and updating grant program criteria that applies to multiple agencies for compliance beyond the neighborhood centers. So you'll notice that there's an earlier deadline relating to prioritizing projects in neighborhood centers, and then later for compliance, like having completed the HNAs, et cetera. At the beginning of 2028, housing action plans must be posted locally and submitted to DOLA for acceptance. And then ongoing, there is ongoing status reporting every 3 years and a recurring requirement every 6 years for the HNA and Housing Action Plan processes. Resources available, directory of strategies, templates, tools, samples, if you remember the clearinghouse functionality, and also the Housing Needs Planning Technical Assistance Fund, that grant program. Okay, that's the end of the housing planning one. And so to make some bigger picture comments, I wanted to make sure that this audience is aware of our next steps. So our immediate priorities are internal multi-bill implementation planning and rollout, which is underway, the required mapping for the TOC bill and the parking bill. That also, as I mentioned earlier, but to reiterate, is underway, almost done with data acquisition, and hopefully we'll have something reviewable. I'll just use the word soon. But yeah, the end of September is coming faster than I'm comfortable with. I wish time would slow down, but alas. And then procurement planning for time-sensitive deliverables. So for example, the housing opportunity goal calculation methodology is an early out one, as well as moving into next steps, the HNA methodology that we need to publish by the end of this year. So that also is coming up rather quickly. Also preliminary compliance guidance. So the first out is going to be the occupancy reform guidance. I'm really hoping to post that shortly, and then others to follow. We'll be doing also some web development beyond our initial landing pages to hopefully create a space for some more, well, I don't want to overpromise, but the idea is a space to combine all of this information and beyond. I'll just stop there for now. We need to work on the thinking there and the realm of what's possible. And then finally, we need to establish the multi-bill stakeholder process. So speaking of that, of stakeholder engagement, here's where we're at, and also my pitch to you. What we know is who for the stakeholder engagement, because these laws do list specific interests that need to be included, and specific organizations in some cases that need to be included. So that's very clear. We also know what. So for example, the two reports listed in 174, the housing planning bill, the HNA methodology development, grant program criteria, the form and manner documents, displacement risk methodology, best practices for parking, transit area map. There are many pieces of things that we need to put forward and publish that have mandatory engagement. So that's in there, that's very clear. But what we don't know is, again, who, meaning exact contacts, and when. So the timing for when we may have some of these meetings, which if you were paying attention to the timelines will come up sooner than later. So my pitch, my request would be, please email me if you would like to be part of our bench of technical experts. What we are considering at the moment is having, working very closely with our usual partners, your local government membership organizations, for example, and also having a bit of a bench of technical experts that we could draw from, ask questions, sort of refine some of these pieces, and of course have broader meetings as well. So I would say that you don't necessarily need to say yes to being in our bench of technical experts in order to receive information and participate in giving your input. But if you would like to be on that bench, please do let me know. If you would not, but just want to get updates, also please email me with contact information. If you are on this distribution list, then that's very helpful. But we are continually building out contact lists. And until we can get a more developed, sort of comprehensive web page to sign up for things like push notifications, then emailing me will be your best course of action. So I'll get upset with my inbox later, but please do, I'll say very honestly, please do email me. And then finally, additional resources. We did do a technical webinar on April 8th of this year. It was a deep dive into the framework of the TOC bill. And the information was current as of that time, but if you're wanting for a little bit more information to review on your own, think through the language, that could be a good place to start, as well as our web pages and as we add information there. Speaking of, there is the link, and yes, I will share these slides out so you can see where our landing pages are and where we will be adding more compliance guidance to. And then finally, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar along with FAQs, and I'll make sure to distribute that to this attendee list and promote it through our Community Development Office listserv and wherever else possible. So with that, I'll thank you very much. Here is my email for your reference, and we can now move into the Q&A portion for the rest of the time that we have until 1. Thank you so much for your attention.